All right, hello everyone. We've just ticked over to 11, so we will get started because we have a fair bit of material. Fingers crossed we do have time for questions at the end because we would really love to answer some. But let's get into it. If anyone's coming in, that's totally fine. Just slink in the back, take a seat, but we will get into it now. So we will be talking about narrative pipelines. I'm assuming that's why you're all here. I'm hoping that's why you're all here. I'm a little bit surprised to see this many people, pleasantly surprised. Wonderful that you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. It's just not something that would be considered a very sexy talk, because we are going to be going into a lot of processes and we are going to be getting into that. And we do have some very sexy flowcharts later though. I just want to say they're not until the end. You have to wait for the sexy flowcharts, but we will get to them. And they're very beautiful and Melissa did make them. So thank you for being here today. We have to say a very quick thank you before we get into it. And that is to Alexander Swords. Now, Alexander Swords is a force of nature, a fantastic writer himself, amazing. Also, if you haven't read Forest Paths, which is the book that Alex has written, also does other writing, but this book's also very good. It's a really good narrative design methodology that is worth checking out if you haven't already. Now, I did warn Alex that this was going to happen, so could you please stand up, Alex? Please, thank you. All right, now I need you to do something for me. It's fine. He said I could do this. So you're like the narrative design expert. I'd really like you to the room to make the noise that you think represents narrative design.
I realised it was going to be improv theatre.
Yeah, I warned you, and you were like, it's fine.
That is the noise of narrative design. I didn't realise this is what we were going to be doing today. This was the depth that we needed to go to.
So we need pipelines.
We could possibly need to provide to the rest of the team.
That was a great noise. Solid noise, thank you. But yeah, so Alex is the reason we're here. Thank you so much, Alex. And sorry to everyone else that had to witness that. But yes, we're going to be talking about narrative pipelines. Oh, if we actually want to go to the correct slide, this one? Yes, wonderful. So I'm Ella, and I've spoken at New Zealand GDC before. I absolutely love coming here. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be talking again in person. So I'm a narrative designer currently at Mighty Kingdom. Melissa's my boss. She has to look after me, so no one should envy her that responsibility. And by day, I do narrative design with Mighty Kingdom, and I also, by night, I run like a very small team and make indie games that explore mental health issues and then release them for free on Steam, and they have very strong narrative leanings, and that's what I'm really passionate about. So I love narrative design from more commercial products all the way through to indie products as well, and that's something I'm very, very passionate about. And yes, I did name my Dalmatian Stripes, and I feel like that really represents me as a person, which is why I've put it on the slide. You're welcome.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our talk today. So my name is Melissa, and I'm the narrative discipline lead at Mighty Kingdom. I'm based in Melbourne, and so is Ella. So recently I've been focused a bit more operations than on writing. I have an undergrad in commerce, and I'm currently studying to get my master's of data science, which I'll be getting in October. And it might sound like a cliche, but if I can do it, anyone can. I have a beagle mix named Murphy. I totally love beagles and obsessed with them. And she too is a fan of narrative pipelines. So wait, what do we mean when we say narrative pipelines? So what we're talking about are the processes and systems that a narrative team may establish to integrate into the wider development cycle, from planning all the way through to post-production. So what makes a good pipeline? To understand that, first we need to understand the properties of a pipeline. Pipelines have known inputs and outputs. They can get clogged. You want to be careful what you put into them. And rarely do you want to use the same pipe to transport different materials. So toilet humor aside, there's a couple common things that we'll look for when it comes to a good pipeline. When assessing a pipeline, we want to look for simplicity. All the known general methods, Agile, if you're old school, then PDCA, or Plan, Do, Check, Act, as well as the scientific method, they all have an element of iteration, and it's quick to give and receive feedback. We also look for self-organization, and what that means is the system starts to kind of manage itself, and it feels really natural to those who are using it. And lastly, we would look for clarity of outcome, and that's just that the team always understands what they're working towards, and the output is as expected and clear. So on the slide up here, we've just shown kind of that planning through to post-production phase and kind of things that you would witness in each one, but we'll go through that in a bit more detail later. So why do we love and believe in narrative pipelines? First, we're going to start with why we love narrative. I think everyone here probably loves narrative because you're here at this talk. But for those who don't or want to learn more about narrative, we'll just talk about why we love narrative first. So narrative is power. It can make people behave differently in real life or in game. It can convince players to compete or cooperate. It can create empathy. It can support inclusion. And it can create just really powerful emotion. And it doesn't even have to come from words. It could be just a really well-formed character arc. An Ohio State University Press article showed that players could feel Atreus rebelling against his father on a physiological level in the game God of War, just because of how his personality changed over time and because of his actions. This is the kind of power that narrative has. There's also monetary benefits to narrative. Like, we would much rather own a replica of the One Ring to rule them all than we would some mundane, shiny ring. But we're not business people, we're narrative people, and so we care about the non-monetary benefits. But we'd also argue that there's financial benefit to like having these really strong pipelines incorporated for your narrative teams. So the first reason why we love narrative pipelines is because it creates a much higher quality product. In general, narrative pipelines are good for team health, expectation setting, and identifying the peaks and troughs of work in your team. This might sound anecdotal, but we like to think of it as empirical, as it's based on a lot of our own observations, as well as some theory. Narrative adds intention, not just for players, but also for the wider development team. And people find meaning, like when people find meaning in their work, they feel much more engaged, motivated, and committed. Following that logic, narrative practices should be introduced early into your project to guide several aspects and create that immersion for the whole team. Another reason why narrative pipelines are good to have is that when you start to work out the scope and schedule for a project, if you understand the narrative pipeline, it will start to inform a lot of that wider asset pipeline, the art, the voiceover, the engine work, and any writing requirements. Wisdom dictates that most projects will go over time and over budget, but the closer you can get to that estimate, the greater chance of success for your narrative project. It's worth noting that narrative projects have a few considerations. They're very hungry. They need a lot of content to keep them going. And a lot of that work, it needs to be front-loaded so that narrative doesn't become a bottleneck for others further down the line. And we'll touch on that a bit more later. If there are narrative pipelines, it'll be clear to other disciplines if they can contribute or if they'll be overstepping at certain stages of the project. Narrative has some really close collaborators, though. Like, for example, we'll work really closely with artists and animators to ensure that the assets that are produced will suit the game and the characters in the world. It's also really helpful to have that interdisciplinary feedback on narrative ideas. We've touched a bit on how narrative creates that emotional investment and motivation in the wider team. It helps rally people behind a common goal. And sometimes team members really want to know what's going to happen next in the story. I was on a localization call with some team members in Europe, and they were always so happy to be working on the next batch of content because they wanted to know what was going to happen between two characters who were in like a super slow burn romantic relationship. So like, it's really fulfilling to have that level of passion like in the team and with other stakeholders, like where they can't like wait to see what's going to happen next. I'll briefly talk about the roles of a narrative designer, but Ella will go into this a bit more later. Roles of narrative, they vary a lot from studio to studio, and if you are an indie studio, you might not have the luxury of having a dedicated narrative expert. The good news is that much of what a narrative designer does is actually teachable, and it doesn't take a literary genius. It takes a well-rounded person with high empathy. So yeah, it could be writing, tech, organization, or working in the sphere of influence rather than the sphere of authority, because you're going to be working with people outside of your core team to brief them on assets for the game.
So one of the reasons we wanted to touch briefly on the roles of a narrative designer is that depending on your team structure, you might wear many hats or you might have a role that is a lot more specialized. So some narrative designers only write, some also implement, some are very involved in cutscene creation, which is something that I've had to learn throughout the last year, which has actually been wonderful to learn a new skill set. But it can be quite diverse. And so understanding your team size and your team structure, as well as the roles that you have available to you and the expertise on your team, will really change how you actually make your narrative pipelines as well. But one thing that I one thing, is going to be like a few things, sorry. One thing I would really like to touch on now quickly are some high-level considerations that you need to take into account when building out your pipelines. We're going to give you a bunch of considerations that you can noodle over as you think about how you're going to be structuring your own before we give you some very rough examples, because things are going to change what that pipeline looks like. Okay, so your funding and publishing model is really going to change where things sit in your pipeline and how long things are going to take. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to narrative pipelines, especially because the discipline itself can be very diverse. But we are very passionate about writing being included very, very early with narrative pipelines, because there's this almost like this fiction that writers exist in a vacuum at a games company and they just sit in their little room and they do a bunch of writing and then you take it and you run with it. And that's not the case. And also doing that makes them feel very isolated. And when they're more part of the process, you get stronger narrative games and you get better cross-discipline, like communication, creation, creativity, all that good stuff. So it's really good to adopt a flexible mindset and be open to tweaking your pipeline as you iterate and you learn, and depending on some of these considerations that we're going to be going through. So what is your funding and publishing model? Are you self-published? Are you independent? Are you doing a co-development situation? Is it work for hire? We're not going to be touching on the pros and cons of each of these models because your company's going to be doing what your company's doing, but we would like to touch on how they might impact your narrative pipelines down the line. So if you're self-published and indie, well done, good for you, very exciting. And there are some really big benefits to this in terms of your pipelines. If you're a smaller development team, you can iterate much more efficiently and effectively and rapidly, because you won't have as many other people looking over your shoulder in order to make approvals. You're able to make those decisions yourself, so you will be able to make those calls and you will be able to make them quickly. You're not going to be bogged down in approval processes, and approval processes can take quite a bit of time, and then approval processes themselves can take a lot of refining and streamlining until they're running really efficiently, especially if you're working with a new client or publisher. So co-development, you're going to need to make sure that you're collaborating and aligning across so many different elements of production, and especially narrative as well. This is likely to include external approval processes, but they're not going to be as rigorous as work for hire approval processes, because those will be the times when you are probably the bogged down the most with that. So this means that when you're indie, you're going to be front loading a lot of your pipelines with ideation, world building, etc. But when you're doing like co-development and work for hire, you have to make sure you have that time in your schedule, but you need to be allocating more time throughout your actual like pre-development, development, and even like post-development time for approval processes. So make sure you have the time for it, otherwise narrative will suffer. And then work for hire. This is the one where you need to be factoring the most time for your external approval processes, but also you need to be making documentation, you need to be doing supporting decks and documents, and they all have to be signed off before you can go and do like a lot of work. So consider the necessary check-ins, and that will be an ongoing negotiation between you and the client, and that may change over time as you build trust, as you get more comfortable, but please keep that in mind as well, because it will be rigorous at first. For the most part, like I'm sure there are some wonderful, beautiful unicorn clients out there where it's just easy from the get-go. But normally it's going to be really rigorous until you build that trust. Other considerations, is it original IP or is it going to be licensed IP? So you need to think about this as well. For original IP, you're going to be front loading once again, because you're going to be world building, you're going to be defining the rules of your universe, you're going to be doing character creation, you're going to be doing competitor research, you have to think about your brand identity, you have to spend a lot of time doing this groundwork in order to have a nice smooth process as you move through the development process. However, existing IP is much more like end loaded. So you don't have to actually do that world building. You don't have to do any of that, because you're actually writing for something that already exists. However, a really good example of this is that I'm currently writing on the Star Trek Lower Decks game. If you haven't seen Lower Decks, you should watch it. It's really good. It's like Rick and Morty meets Star Trek. If that is a selling point for any of you, if you hate both of those things, maybe don't do it. But it's really fantastic, and we're developing a game for it. And I'm a huge Trekkie, so this is quite an easy task for me because I have a really intimate understanding of the lore. But not everybody is a Trekkie, and not all your writers are going to be fans of the IP that you're going to be using. So you need to make sure you have time for them to learn about it, to watch the show, to research it. You have to have really good resources that someone has written about the lore, and then there will be a lot more approval processes because you have to be really wary of canon and not interacting with that in a bad way. And it means that you're going to have a really rigorous approval process through the end of your pipeline, and you have to do that every single time you release something. It's not something you can build in once with just pre-production and you're done with it. You have to do it every single time you release content for that game, especially if you're in live service. Every single time it has to get approved because you have to make sure that you're not interfering with the sanctity and integrity of that IP. So keep that in mind as well. And your team composition, we touched on this very briefly earlier. This is going to change things as well. Who's doing what? I'm going to start going a bit quicker because we're starting to eat into time. Sorry, my bad. I love talking if you couldn't tell. So pipelines are going to be different based on your staffing and your staffing needs. Do you have cinematic designers? Has anyone even heard of what a cinematic designer is, by the way? It's like 7 people. That's nice. That's 7 more than I thought we might have. So that's good. So who's implementing the narrative in Engine? This is a really big question I think a lot of studios forget about, and they forget to build into their pipelines. Are you expecting a programmer to do it? Is the programmer already busy? Are you expecting your narrative designer to do it? I just saw one of these. I think that programmer might be busy. Feel you. Not a programmer, but like, understand. Yeah, so who's going to be putting it in Engine? And if it's the narrative designer, do they know how? What tools are you using? Are they aware of what goes into putting something in Engine? So make sure that you think about these things, because if you're going to be using a team member across multiple disciplines or having to do multiple roles, then you're going to have to build out that pipeline longer if you don't have the luxury of hiring another person, for example, to do all your cinematic work and to implement in Engine. So it's not just the planning and the writing and the cross-discipline collaboration. It's also who's putting it in Engine, who's testing it. You have to think about these things as well. So here are just like some breakdowns of some of the roles that you'll get, what they roughly do. I'm not going to talk to you about them all. You can take a photo if you'd like. Saw some phones up. Thank you. So you've got a narrative designer, technical narrative designer, cinematic designer, and writer. They all do different things within the narrative design space. So be aware if you're hiring someone exactly what they do and where their skill set lies, how you can utilize them based on your budget, team size, etc. So these are some common titles you may or may not have in your team, but it's good to think about it in this way. So, narrative tools. Who here knows much about narrative tools? Oh, more hands. Oh, that's nice. That was actually quite a few, thank you. Narrative tools are going to make a really big difference to your narrative pipelines and the amount of time that they take. And your narrative tools are going to take more time early rather than late. So you really need to streamline them, get them up and running. You can still make changes to your narrative tools as you go. And a lot of the time, once you're doing live service, things like that, a lot of your time will be spent streamlining and owning your processes. And that will be everything from writing to approval processes to the tools that you use and making improvements. But you need to think about what tools you're going to be using. So what are the tools that you're going to use? What's the technical skill set of your narrative designer? What level of documentation do they require? What level of internal training is there? Do you have a training program? What's the learning curve? Is it very difficult? Is it very easy? Can you pick it up, put it down? How are you going to be doing that? So think about that and plan for that in your pre-production, and then keep working on that as you move into production as well. And are you going to be using a third-party tool? Are you going to make your own tool? If you're going to make your own tool, that's awesome, live your best life, but make sure you have time for that, and make sure you have time to test that, especially before you chuck a narrative designer in the deep end and expect them to use the tool that you've made. So consider all of that as well, and how easy they are to use. Also, if you're using a third-party tool, is it regularly updated? Is it going to become obsolete? is that going to become a problem down the line? So there's a whole bunch that you can do. You can build your own tools that narrative designers use externally from the engine that then plug into the engine. So you can make some, and I've worked in one of those circumstances before where I put everything into this little visual pretty tool, and then it spat out a whole bunch of data that just put itself into Unity. I don't have to do anything in Unity. Now I work in Unity, and that's fantastic, and we have a really nice setup to do that within Unity. But you can also just, Excel spreadsheets can be great. You can plug them straight in with all of your dialogue. Really handy tool, especially if you just don't have the time to be doing anything else at that point. It's a starting point. You can use Twine, you can use Ink. There are a whole bunch of tools that help you with branching narratives if that's something that you're going to be doing and are interested in, which is a whole other talk unto itself. So we're going to move on. Do they have support? Can you do localization easily? Is there a help desk? Can you go and ask for help? Because if you have an internal tool and something goes wrong and the program is on holiday, like, you're going to have a really hard time. But if you're using a third-party tool, are you going to be able to get the support that you need? Great. So tailoring for various stages of production. We're getting to the sexy flowcharts. Okay, thank you. Had a lot to say before we got to them, so thank you so much. Now, it's really important to have narrative pipelines, and if you haven't introduced them already at pre-production, that's fine. Maybe introduce them now, because the earlier that you introduce them, the less drama and stress you're going to have. So any time is better than no time. You've made choices, it's fine, we understand. But the earlier the better. That would be great. You don't want to be bringing them in too late. You don't want to be shoehorning narrative into a process at the last minute, because it will mean that your narrative not as cohesive, it's not as holistic, it won't work as well with every other element of your game, and it won't be as effective. So ideally, when you have that cross-discipline collaboration, you're going to have a much more holistic story that is going to stand out and will resonate with people, because you'll have the luxury of time to do that, and it'll also it'll be better. It'll be improved on all counts. Okay, you can talk now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sexy flowcharts are coming.
Yes, very soon. All right, so next we're going to go through an example of how to build a narrative pipeline from the ground up, and we're going to go through each stage of production and break them down one by one. So yeah, just a heads up, these are just an example. It doesn't need to go exactly like this. It's just purely to try and discuss how this process works.
Also, if you want to take photos, please feel free, because we're not going to go through every single little bit on these pipelines themselves, and we will make them available afterwards as well, and the slides available for anyone that wants them if you want the resources. But yeah, we won't be going through them point by point. So if you're interested, please feel free.
Awesome. Okay, so in the planning stage, you can expect narrative to be contributing to theme and genre exploration, as well as early character and plot development. If you have the luxury of time, it's worthwhile to do a team-wide story brainstorm, but ensuring that this is led by narrative and all those ideas are funneled by narrative. The output of a planning stage is likely a high-level concept or a pitch deck. It's just worth noting these steps aren't prescriptive. So the key focus of planning is to manage chaos. A project is at its most complex early on, since it's a blank canvas and there's just so many options for what it could become. And making a story-driven game without introducing narrative early on is like trying to build a bridge without understanding the laws of physics. You can do it, but it won't be the Sydney Harbor Bridge, and your mechanics may not make sense, your world may not make sense, and the characters may lack depth and purpose. So the worst thing you could do is try and retrofit the story to incorporate all of the art and mechanics that have been done so far. It doesn't mean it can't be a good game, but story is no longer the pillar. The mechanics are. So yeah, in this flowchart up here for planning, you could see an example of the output of having a pitch deck and kind of the steps we would take to get there, but we'll move along. So pre-production. This phase is mostly about managing waste. This is a stage where narrative will develop documentation related to world building and lore, and also work on writing guidelines that will feed into early drafts of work, item descriptions, and other assets. Writers' rooms should also start to happen, where people come prepared with drafts of their work, ready to seek feedback and problem solve on work that's actually going to be productionized. So yeah, that could be really hard riddles you need to solve within your team, but that stuff should be starting to happen. Also, again, the steps aren't prescriptive. So this leads to a nice Japanese word, pokeyoke, which means mistake proofing or error prevention. And the idea is that you want to introduce writing guidelines to help reduce waste further down the line. Likewise, trying to write your script before having an outline in place is like trying to build an IKEA table without having the instructions. So you can do it, and you're going to have to make things fit in really strange ways, but it's going to result in a lot of rework and defects and overproduction. And by overproduction, we just mean like writing too much. Obviously, like during the normal iterative cycle, there'll be like writing that you have to throw away just to improve what you're doing. But overproduction is a bit different to that. In pre-production, it's also good to think about ways that you can take away cognitive overload for the team. So this could be as simple as just developing templates for a lot of the things that you work on. It frees up your team to focus on being creative and innovative and not thinking about the best way to get a job done. So in the production phase, narrative has already had like a really big start in planning and pre-production, but there'll still be lots to do in production. This stage is all about adding value, and where possible, you want to optimize the bigger picture and try and do tasks concurrently when possible. You also may want to brief assets very early in this stage, ensuring that you're mindful of other disciplines' asset production timelines and any feedback rounds that they need to go through. You should also be thinking of ways you can maximize the impact for players and continue to polish. There will naturally come a point where any marginal change doesn't improve the script very much. So it's better to just think of perfection as having a really good feedback culture and everyone being really proud of what they've made, instead of trying to polish that script to a point where it's not really, feasible. It's also important that having a perfect script, it shouldn't mean that narrative is starting to become a bottleneck for others around them, especially if you have voiceover or translation teams waiting on you. Production can also be a really good opportunity to skill people up because you'll be doing a lot of polish and engine implementation. And it's a good opportunity to like show people other parts of narrative and give them a much more holistic view of the production process for narrative. Yeah, so release, not really a phase, more of a milestone, but we just wanted to call out it should be all about celebration. And yeah, all of our best memories, they aren't about our individual achievements, but those moments that we had celebrating with the team and bringing something to release. It takes a certain level of team to get to that point, and you might not be the best team in the world, but your resilience and dedication should just always be appreciated. Also, there might be scary bugs that start to crop up, so just kind of put that.
Like a sobering add-on.
So post-production, this is our final phase, and it's all about reflection. There'll also be opportunities to address any critical bug fixes, and also be proactive for future work, which may be content like DLCs, sequels, or other new content that is just going to be continuously released to players. If there is no future content, consider all the things that were compromised, all the ideas that didn't work, that did work. They should be noted down. And if there is future work, consider all the things that were compromised, ideas that didn't work, that did work. They should be noted down. If there are any learnings that are good enough to share with the wider team in a showcase, then those should also be part of the pipeline if they aren't already. And that brings me to another nice Japanese word, kaizen, the idea of continuous improvement. So something we'd like to do more of in this stage is utilizing quantitative and qualitative data. And it really depends where you work and the data competency of your narrative team. Most people can understand qualitative data, but you can listen to what players are saying post-release, like on social media. Just consider if anything is viable as part of future content or just to take learnings from. You want to be listening to that. So this is an example, like a real example, of a post-production pipeline that we used to repeatedly deliver content on Ava's Manor. So I know it's a slightly different format, and hopefully you can read it, but basically we would have regular deliveries, and it was kind of based around the initial decision of what location is going to be like the highlight of this next chunk of content. So it could be like an art studio, it could be a soccer field, it could be things like that. Could could be a guest room. There's lots of things. So we'd pick a location, and then we'd work with 2D art and 3D art and our publisher to get those briefs done and get some concepts going for that. I should probably just call out, the purple ones are corresponding to like the narrative team tasks, and then the blue ones are our cinematic team. So we'd work like really closely with them to integrate the story into cutscenes. So yeah, the narrative would do beat planning and chapter outlining, and we'd do like review sessions out of that. The green ones are kind of like the outputs of in between all of those little stages. So yeah, this was like refined a lot over a long period of time, and we had many, many deliverables kind of using this until it became really seamless. But yeah, I think like where you can identify these like cyclical things and your products, especially like live service type projects, that's where pipelines are really going to help you as well.
Can we just go back to that one
Yeah,
for
yeah.
1 second? So I came in at the end of this project and I was on 2 chapters, but to give you an idea of the fact of like how this all worked and how streamlined this was, by the time I got onto it, it was amazing and Melissa had done all the work. But how many chapters were there and how many words were there? How much time did you have to get to this point?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we probably had about like 24 chapters of content, but that probably means nothing to anyone. But basically each chapter would have around like 40 or 50 cutscenes, and those cutscenes would probably be like between 20 and 40 lines long. And the whole, like all of the words that we did on script and all of that, it was like 160,000 words. So...
So it was a lot, and the whole time that Melissa was there, she like just kept refining, and I came on and I'm like, this is easy. Is this how it always is? No.
Yeah, it was a bit more of like a dialogue heavy game. So we had to be, we really had to like map out all of those stages of like outlining and scripting and making sure that we're reviewing those scripts so that they're snappy and nice. But yeah, we won't go over that now. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to give everyone an idea of like how big a task it can be and how long it can take to get to a really streamlined process, because there's a lot of trial and error in there too.
Yeah, definitely. And lots of lessons. Anyway, let's not reflect.
Not triggered.
Yeah, so in the previous slides, we specifically saw narrative slice in the pipeline. And there were obviously like some interactions with other disciplines, but to include them all, like we could not do it on a slide. So what you'll be seeing soon is a matrix that kind of shows our interactions with other disciplines throughout various stages of the project. And the key idea for these interactions is to find places where any cross-discipline decision-making or just collaboration might become a bottleneck. So yeah, you can kind of think of the critical chain, which means critically thinking about interdependence and resource constraints and just trying to find concurrency where we can in the production. So this doesn't have to be the job of a lead. I actually think that people who are more hands-on have a really strong idea of these touch points, which we will look at now. Yeah, so
remember how earlier I said that people have this idea that writers just go off into their little room and do some writing and it comes out and then it just happens? This is why that is a complete fiction. If you're doing your narrative pipelines properly and you're prioritizing narrative and you're building a game that's narrative heavy, this is what should be happening. And there are so many places where narrative does come in contact with other disciplines. And as Melissa said, we actually couldn't fit them all on here. This is probably a good one to take a photo of if you're interested. And there will definitely be more circumstances than just this. So a few that we couldn't fit on are community and marketing, really big ones. So your community manager, fingers crossed in-house, we love a in-house community manager, will give you, woohoo, whoever that was. Yeah, love that for you. Love that you're in-house. Really, really useful for getting feedback and gathering data and also understanding what players would like to see, what they're excited about, what resonates with them, so that you can highlight that moving forward and have player retention. Narrative can be fantastic for player retention, especially in live service games, and it's something which is underutilized, but we're seeing come out more and more with mobile games with like strong narratives, because people are starting to realize that, there is a financial benefit. We're not here to talk about financial benefit, but if you need to hear the words financial benefit, you've heard them now. It's really good for that too. But yeah, so you'll be working with community, you'll be getting feedback, you'll be implementing feedback, you'll be taking it on board, and also marketing. That's something that happens a little bit earlier on and then in an ongoing basis in live service. But a lot of the time, marketing need promotional materials and they need to tell a little bit of that narrative in a snapshot for a poster or something that's going on the App Store, etc. So your narrative designers will work with your artists and you'll talk about sort of like the story and what feelings you want to elicit. That will go to marketing. Marketing will then pass that on. But there's a lot here, as you can see. So you are going to be touching as a narrative designer in a well-functioning studio that encourages cross-discipline interaction and collaboration, all of this and more. So like if there's any that you particularly want me to talk about, I'm happy to, but there's a lot here that I think surprises people as well. And that is a lot of the time your narrative designers end up helping out with your audio stuff. I mean, obviously you might be writing character arcs, you might be helping with voiceovers, but there's been times where I've been in the voice acting studio on the other side, like directing people, and I just did not expect that that was something that was going to happen or be part of my role, and I loved it. Super fun. But that's something that often does fall to your narrative designers. I've also seen that fall to production, but typically it comes to your audio people and your narrative. And of course, 2D art is one that you're going to be interacting with a lot, art teams in general, because it's a very collaborative process back and forth with briefs. What does the character feel like? What's their personality? Is that represented in the art? And there's a lot of back and forth there, especially as your narrative designers often will write your briefs for assets, and then your artists will be the ones that are filling those briefs. And even like UI and UX. Honestly, planning how your writing is delivered through the user interface and the user experience. Also, narrative is really heavily involved in your FTUI, first time user experience. Just said that and probably realized I should explain what that is. Your first time user experience, if you're doing a game that's got narrative in it, is going to be really like narrative heavy, and you're going to have a hook that's quite immediate. How are you going to present that? How is that going to come across to players? And then even just considerations like if you're using text bubbles, how many characters can you have in them? Your UI and your UX person are going to be the ones that are going to be working with you on that. Little bit of 2D art still there, lots of crossing over because you need sizes, you need assets, etc. But your UI and your UX will understand how many words is too many, where your retention is with line lengths, and that's going to inform your process forever moving forward with your conventions and your style guides and how many words you can have per bubble to keep player attention, things like that. So yeah, it's quite surprising how much you can be across, and it will just make your game stronger if narrative is one of your pillars and values and one of your goals. So keep this all in mind. I swear it's not as scary when you actually do it. I realize that looks like a lot, but it's actually quite seamless. And when you refine your process and your pipeline, it only gets increasingly seamless. All right. So you might want to use tracking and documentation tools. Thought we just mentioned some really quickly because you're going to need a lot of documentation and you're going to need to track things. So Jira's industry standard. Everyone pretty much knows and loves Jira. It's classic. It's classic for a reason. It's robust. It's really good for pipelines. You can build out really good pipelines, roadmaps. You can see when things are due. You can have tickets. You know what tasks are happening. You can assign them to sprints. This really helps with building out your pipelines. It's great. Definitely use it. If you don't want to spend any money, you can use Notion. Notion's really good, really like Notion. Really good for indie teams. It's really good for documentation as well as tracking. It's really good for tracking. It's pretty much a free program that has a bunch of widgets. So you can just kind of like grab a bunch of widgets and change them as you need to. And it's a really good documentation tool and also has like quite robust road mapping abilities and a ticketing system. It's not quite as good as Jira because Jira is very specialized, but Notion is more of an all-rounder and it can be implemented really well. It's also really good for note taking and for world building and lore, things like that. Really good. You got Confluence. Confluence is very documentation heavy. It's part of the Atlassian suite, so it's got great compatibilities across everything. It's awesome. And then if you're really visual, one that is worth checking out is Millernote because it organizes ideas and projects, but it is really visual. So if you as a narrative designer are very visual, it's fantastic. Or if you work with a team that really is good with visual learning and visual representation, it's worth having a look at. And of course, you can use multiple of these. You don't want to use too many because things can get spread out across a lot. And you don't really want to be moving between tracking and documentation tools if you can avoid it, because it takes a long time to reset up and to get everyone familiar with your new tool. And then you'll have to train them. And then you'll probably have to put that in your narrative pipeline. Who knows? So keep that in mind and think about what tools you want to use and how you're going to train people to use them. Alrighty. Wow, we got through lots. I'm very proud of us.
Not that on time.
Yeah. Just some key takeaways.
Yeah, awesome. So we hope like today you have learned a few things that will motivate you and give you the tools you need to make your own narrative pipelines. A few takeaways we'd like to just emphasize: one size doesn't fit all, and it's really going to come down to your team and your studio's kind of work styles. And it's best to just accept that the first thing you do won't be the right thing. You'll have to make modifications over time as you iterate on as you go through that process and see how it could be better. Planning's key, and it's really important, especially for a narrative, to really formalize and demystify the role of narrative in the wider development cycle. We briefly spoke about finding efficiencies when working with other disciplines, but we like to call it finding effectiveness when working with other disciplines, because people often confuse efficiency with utilization or overwork. So you have your interdiscipline opportunities, but you also have your intradiscipline, or within the narrative team, opportunities to try and find tasks that you can do concurrently and look out for the critical chain. So unless you need human level discretion or something isn't really repetitive, then it's probably worth just automating it. It reduces waste, and again, it lets people focus on the creative. And one of the easiest things to automate is Jira, and if you can't do it, just ask your producer. So thanks everyone for being such a great audience, and we hope that you've been able to see how pipelines can help you manage chaos, reduce waste, add value, and make your team feel more empowered.
This is us. Thank you. You can follow me for it'll validate me. Thanks. Just really quickly, because apparently I want to embarrass people today. I'd like to say that this has actually been Melissa's first talk, not that you'd ever know, because she's fantastic. So really well done. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you. It was lovely to do it together.
Yeah. Just never-ending embarrassment all around. But if anyone has questions, we got through it all. We have time. I wasn't sure we were going to. So
8 minutes.
If anyone would like to ask questions about narrative pipelines, please.
Yeah. Hi. Do you have any advice for work for hires who are brought on at the really late into production?
Ooh. Okay. Choices. It's fine.
I think it is a really difficult thing to try and fix. I think, there's been a couple times in the past on projects where, not work for hires, but just narrative designers were brought in late on certain projects, and it did result in compromised narrative quality. So, I think you can only do the best you can being brought in late, and you can try and dot point learnings to share with those companies about why maybe you should have been brought in earlier, but it's a really hard thing to try and navigate through, and there isn't really one answer. It just depends on, I guess, all the circumstances at play with that studio and that project. But I would just try and sell them on the benefit of having had brought you in earlier.
I'd probably add to that, better late than never, sort of. And I think that the studio and the client will both have to understand that the narrative at this point will be compromised. And then it becomes a bit of a game of, okay, if it's going to be compromised, that's fine. It's not going to be to the level we want it to be. What are the things within our control now that it's being introduced this late that we are able to champion so that it comes to a level of quality that we're comfortable with? It's not going to be necessarily a quality that you're stoked, amazing, this is the best thing I've ever made. But what are the things that you can triage that will make it good enough out the door? Have that discussion with the client, have that discussion in the team, and then empower, if you're the writer or whatever writer you bring in, to do those things, and then have your key learnings. But really just triage and understand the bare bones of what you have to get out, and then also understand what you can get out, because sometimes those are also not aligned. And I'd say start there, and I think that'd be the best
that's good advice.
way to do it. Yeah.
Good. First of all, awesome talk, so thank you.
Thank you.
Questions a bit like this. So you have the planning stage at the beginning of the project, and you're absolutely right that as in the narrative team, you have to talk to all these other disciplines. But when you don't know what to tell them yet, for example, while you're sorting out the story, it's hard to tell what the characters of the story need to be. So what work can you give to the characters team while you're working out the story?
Are you asking about world building and characterization and things like that?
Yeah. So you've got everybody needs to do work obviously in the project.
Yes.
So until you have a story, it's hard to tell who the characters need to be. So how do you work out that list of dependencies basically?
All right, so I think this answer is going to be quite different across different teams and also across different writers and writing styles. So it really comes down to what your budget is. How many characters can you have? Look at the money, I would say, first when you start planning how many characters you need. That's where I would start personally, because I know if I was just given a blank page and said make something, I'd be like, oh, it's my Game of Thrones opus, let's go. I want 100 characters. But if that's not in budget, that's not going to work. So understand how many characters you can have. And then, is there any world building already done for the story? Do you know what story you're telling?
No, this would be for a brand new IP.
Brand new IP, okay. So I like to base the amount of characters that I'm going to be putting into a story based on budget and based on how many characters I need to tell a story. I don't want any, fat in my story. I want to cut it out. I just want to have it be as lean as possible. So I want to have as few characters to tell the story that I need to tell so that I can keep costs down and so that I can keep my storytelling effective. So it's going to really depend on the story you're telling. I couldn't give you a strong answer on you need this many characters or you need to decide on this way until you know the story you're telling, and you don't even need to know your world at that point. As long as you know what story you're telling and how many characters you need to tell that story and you have a budget, also important, that's how you have to get started. When it's just a complete blank page, it's terrifying and it's really hard because you just don't know. There's all these rules that you don't know yet, and knowing some of those rules helps.
And just on that, it's just important to remember that every character should serve a distinct purpose. And even if you are trying to introduce some really flat, kind of boring character that doesn't have a lot of traits, it should be for a reason to serve as some contrast against the others. So just remembering the purpose, I guess understanding the themes of the story you're trying to tell and what characters will have the purpose to reach that as well.
It's a hard one, actually. No, thank you. It's a good thought exercise.
Very insightful talk. The table with how the interactions with all the other disciplines and showing how narrative is just interconnected with everyone. So helpful. I wanted to ask, what are some of the gotchas or challenges that come up in the narrative pipeline, and what do you do to overcome them?
Sometimes, this one happened recently on a project I was working on where, working with existing IP and we need to get everything approved because law, canon, all that stuff. There was only one person on their side who had enough understanding of the law to make those approvals, and they were sick for 2 weeks. And our entire pipeline got destroyed because we couldn't get the approvals we needed to work. So we ran out of work and we're like, okay, well, how can we pivot? What bugs can we fix? Can we go fix narrative bugs? Can we fix some narrative bugs in Engine? Let's go fix bugs. That's the level of we were looking for work that we got to as a narrative team. But also, how can we future-proof? How can we do documentation? But sometimes things happen, especially when you do co-development or work for hire, where someone's not available or something happens in the company that you're working with, and you have these really beautiful, robust pipelines, and you just cannot use them. And that's something that when we were aware, we were like, okay, well, if there's this issue again, what can we do about it? Because we can't be bogged down in this way. And we did work with our partner to have some ideas in place and to have some other people that could take on the brunt of that work. And we have contingency plans now. But sometimes things just happen like that you don't expect. And then you have to sit down and find a way around. Little happy surprises.
So I think we've got time for just one more question before lunch, if anyone has one.
What are some of yours?
Hello.
Some?
Yeah.
Okay, how do I phrase this? So I'm a remote worker and I've basically nagged my team into having a story for our next game and they've listened to me.
Woohoo.
Thanks, guys.
I love it.
But
Well done.
yeah, I'm really annoying.
Proud of you. So am I. I know. I feel it.
But an issue that I'm finding is that I'm having a bit of trouble getting people to buy in
Yep.
to the vision of having a narrative for a game that's going to be, it's a city builder, so it's very systems heavy. do you guys have any tips on how to help the team buy into a vision?
Do you have?
Make them play RimWorld. That's all I have to say. Sorry, you go, please. That's my recommendation.
I think it can be really helpful to involve like the whole team and just like a short call, kind of like outlining. Like it depends on how the content is going to be delivered. If it's like, I assume there'll be like continuous chunks of content, narrative content being rolled out. But yeah, it's like really helpful to involve people in that process and like let them know what's coming up, whether it's like in a Slack channel, like dropping a summary and like adding all this excitement, or just like having a 30-minute call and like running people through that and giving them an opportunity to like ask questions or flag like concerns about feasibility of certain things that you want to do as well. But yeah, just like making people feel included in that process. And we kind of touched on it in the planning slide. It is really exciting for people to just like throw out their story and character ideas. So like it might be good to have a workshop that you include the wider team, but it's kind of being facilitated and led by narrative and controlled by them and stuff. But I think people just love that opportunity. So yeah, workshops or short calls, just like updating them on your plans, and just like generating excitement in Slack or whatever kind of forum, whatever kind of channels you use for communication.
I think another way to sometimes get buy-in as well is to find a way to show them why narrative will help their particular title make money. Like that's a really good way to get buy-in from people if they're like a little bit on the fence. And so narrative games get a lot of reviews and people remember narrative. And if there's a way that you could grab some data on that, and especially for your genre and the kind of game that you're making, that will help a lot. And that's one thing that you can show to stakeholders and you can show to a company and be like, hey, well, actually, like these games get more reviews, which means that it gets more visibility on Steam, which means that it gets downloaded more and it gets purchased more. Like if you can have those sorts of things, especially initially, and then get people to buy in emotionally, if you can get them to buy in on a few different fronts, you'll have a much easier time selling a narrative. They can buy in financially and then emotionally, and then they can see the benefits of having done it and like reap the rewards of all the work you've done. Then that's like a really positive thing as well. So try and find some ways to have both approaches where you can kind of get the rational and the emotional and put them together, and that will probably give you a better base to make an argument about including a narrative. So something like that I think would also work quite well in tandem. Like I think you wouldn't want to just use the financials because it can be hard to prove at times, even when you've got some data. Like the emotional is important, but sometimes having both makes it more interesting to them. So thanks everyone.